Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at the Competitive Advantage Talks presented by Kager, also known as Craft Analytics Group. My name is Carl McKay. I am a Sloan MBA student, and it is my pleasure to introduce the following presentation: Emerging Sports Betting and Health Data from the Front Lines of a Power 4 University. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Chief Mental Health Officer and UHC Executive Director at the University of Michigan, Lindsay Mortensen.
Thanks, Carl. You've been great to work with, and thank you all for being here today. It's an honor to present at this year's conference. Let's get started. I've got about 20 minutes. I'm going to move quickly, so we hopefully have time for questions. And if you have any questions about the data I'll present later, there'll be a link at the end to the SSRN article where the working paper's been posted that I'm going to reference. So every medical talk starts with this slide, so I'm not going to break with tradition. My background is in medicine. I'm a psychiatrist by training and also board certified in clinical informatics. And I don't have any commercial or financial conflicts of interest to report, but I think it's important to be transparent about the perspectives I bring to this topic. So all of the experiences on the left inform my thinking about sports betting and college students. And when I think back to the 17-year-old volleyball player you see here at the top, navigating the usual challenges of a college student: 3-day practices, adjustment to college, balancing academics, sport and social life, not to mention the usual developmental milestones of a college student. The rate of change since then, since I was in college, and the greater complexity that student athletes navigate, the transfer portal, NIL, sports betting, social media, is mind-blowing. But I'm also informed by these other experiences like investment banking, AmeriCorps, higher education, and my 2 medical specialties. And so know that these inform the perspective I'm sharing with you today, and that my brain has a bias and an interest in intersectionality, in what happens when you bring the edges of different disciplines together. So speaking of intersectionality, online sports betting has got this in spades. And before I get to the learning objectives, let's take a look at the major intersections and edges that make online sports betting so enticing. Online sports betting sits at the center of these 5 sectors, some of the most powerful industries in the United States. Keep this intersectionality in mind as we move through these learning objectives. Now, I don't remember a lot about my first weeks and months as an investment banking analyst at the age of 21, 22, 23, working in middle market mergers and acquisitions, but I remember these words from the Excel trainer still today. State your assumptions. So I'm going to share 5 assumptions that inform my curiosity and concern about this topic. And before that, I want to share a version of some of the calls I've received over the past year from friends, neighbors, and parents. It often starts like this: do you have a minute? I have a question. And this is a composite. This is not a particular phone call, but this is a phone call. I've probably received 5 to 10 of these just in the past year. And the conversation gets harder, and it usually finishes something like this. So I think this slide probably speaks for itself. It's not hyperbole, and there's not exactly a playbook for these conversations. Every single one is hard. And here's why. And here's where I get to the assumptions. Number 1, the human brain is under construction for a really, really long time. It's like the longest remodeling project ever, 25 years. The human brain has all the typical construction elements: architecture, those are the cellular connections; plumbing, which is blood flow; electricity, which is neural transmission; and even insulation, which is cerebral spinal fluid. And it is dynamically changing and actively remodeling through your mid-20s. You retain, obviously, some neuroplasticity after 25, but it's actively remodeling until then. And unfortunately, there's asynchronicity in 2 key brain functions: that creates a very large window of vulnerability for young adults. The limbic region in purple is responsible for emotions and rewards. It's not fully developed until age 20 to 25. The control region in green, which is responsible for control and executive function, is not fully developed until age 25. This complexity of the brain informs this first assumption, or one of my North Stars, which is do no harm. The benefits to the individual and potentially the community of any product should outweigh the harms. Second, there's a difference between nudge and sludge. Nudges are often used in health promotion and other industries to encourage positive behavior without financial incentives or without reducing someone's freedom to choose. But there's a dark version of nudges called sludge. Sludge was assiduously studied in the report on the right, and the term was originally coined by a behavioral economist. And what sludge does is undercut a player's ability to choose wisely. Or worse, it encourages self-defeating behaviors, like investing in a deal that is too good to be true. Sludge is something you don't want a developing, impulsive brain going up against. But given how easy it is to sports bet online, for a range of factors, lack of ID verification, lower legal gambling ages in many states, proxy betting on someone else's account, that's exactly what's happening. My third assumption. On the one hand, we have a wealth of self-report data from college students. These are just a few examples on the left, and these are great reports. But almost any equation you want to solve related to sports betting harms and risks is impossible to even write. There are too many unknown independent variables. We are in a dark age of analytics and research when it comes to college student sports betting. The best data and the key dependent variables are sitting inside closed systems. In other words, this very basic linear multivariate regression analysis for the data nerds in the room, this is an easy one, is unsolvable. And here's where the data fails us again. Two of the most commonly deployed screening tools for gambling, the NODS and the BBGS, the Brief Biopsychosocial Gambling Screen, assess for relatively severe harms and risk to the gambler. They don't assess harm to others. That's called collateral damage. And they don't assess the milder harms that can accrue in higher frequency to create greater harms over time. And this issue is on full display here with the prevention paradox that's been extensively studied here in the state of Massachusetts. Many, many prevention efforts are focused on severe manifestations of problem gambling or gambling disorder. In public health, this is called tertiary prevention. And that's important and necessary. But the greatest population impact is on the left. The lower time, lower spend, lower intensity bettors, they create the greatest number of harms, and these harms accrue and can create big problems. Keep this in mind with the data I show in a few slides. Okay, here's my last assumption. The issue of harm or cost and how we measure it is core to sports betting. We all know that compulsive behavior and addictions don't only impact the user, they impact others. That's a no-brainer. This is a really critical concept, and I almost didn't state this assumption because it's such a no-brainer, but when you look at the gambling screening tools, the language at the end of sports betting ads, two things are clear. They're targeted toward the problem bettor with the most severe losses or harms. This first paper from Australia, where sports gambling has been legal for more than 40 years, since 1983, quantifies that impact on families, partners, children, bank accounts, friends, others. On average, it's a 1-to-6 harm ratio. But the impact is not only on the gambler's inner circle. As this NCAA study across various championships in the 2023 season demonstrated, the behavior of so-called toxic bettors, their term, not mine, was so beyond the pale that the report required a cover sheet warning of explicit content. This is a really busy slide, but all of these colors reflect the different kinds of harassment that not just players, but coaches and staff received last year. The most prevalent threats were sexual abuse and threats of violence. And women were 3 times more likely to be targeted than male athletes, basketball, gymnastics, volleyball. You get the picture. And while the most common targets were athletes, coaches and officials were definitely not spared. And finally, we have one of the most hard equations of all to solve. Death by suicide is a complex act that is often never fully understood. Last year, I was interviewed for this perspective piece in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I candidly told the reporter that it was impossible to know what might be driving the doubling of the rate of death by suicide in college athletes. There are a range of possibilities: the pandemic, NIL, the transfer portal, sports betting, higher potency THC and cannabis, global and political events, etc., but no clear answers. In the medical literature, no clear reasons is called unknown etiology. And you can imagine how unsatisfying that is to researchers, but especially to loved ones. I was forced to admit to the reporter for this article on the right that our data and research are not good enough to provide any concrete answers. Okay. As my colleagues and I started fielding more questions about sports betting at the University of Michigan, we were faced with the reality of no data, zero, about college students in the years since the 2018 US Supreme Court decision that legalized sports gambling. We wanted to understand more about our own students. We wanted to understand it quickly, about their experiences and how concerned to be. And the quickest way to ascertain this is something super old-fashioned, what's called a convenience sample survey. And we deployed a paper survey, yes, paper, in our clinic, the clinic that I lead, which has 14 different clinics and service lines last fall. Here's what we did know before we started. The rate of formal gambling disorder is very low. That is probably a detection issue, but that's a conversation for another day. The existing screening tools have three major drawbacks. One, they focus on the very severe end of the clinical spectrum, most anchored to what's called the DSM-5 criteria for gambling disorder. There's not a validated tool in the college student population, and there's very little focus on harm to others in traditional gambling screens. So we borrowed questions from two established sources, the NOD screen and the recent NCAA commissioned survey of young adults in 2023, and then we added 5 custom questions. And here's what we learned from the 575 responses. There were 31% were men, 64% women, 5% identified as non-binary, 62% were undergrads, 38% were graduate or professional students, and then we weighted the sample data to reflect the demographics of our enrolled student population. So this first question is called a warm-up. It's a commonly used survey technique, and it serves 2 purposes. It introduces participants to the general aim of the survey and activates relevant information and engagement, and I hope it's doing the same for you right now. So this question assesses perception, not a measurable reality of diagnosable problem gambling, but reflects the experience of others. And so how do you think students responded in our sample? Take a silent guess. Okay. I did not predict a number this high. And the reason for that is because of the data I already shared with you that gambling disorder suggests a prevalence of 1% or 2 to 3% for mild or moderate issues. So what do you think it means that almost 15% of our sample think they know somebody with a sports betting problem? Here's what we found out next. This is another custom question, and it was informed by personal experience of friends and colleagues seeing young adults more fixated than ever on their phones during sporting events. A few years ago, I couldn't have imagined that young adults could become even more glued to their phones. But that's what's happening. And whereas in the past, all eyes might be glued to the same TV screen, you know, like the proverbial cavemen around the fire kind of thing, now we see something different. And some people tell us they can no longer enjoy sports unless they have active bets going. And the neurobiology of this is not surprising at all, because sports betting provides one trip on the dopamine roller coaster after another. It's important to know that in our sample, for this almost 14%, we don't really know how this pressure is occurring. Is it indirect? Is it direct? Is it self-imposed due to FOMO or fear of missing out? Either way, there was a very significant signal for young male college students in particular, as you can see, that was statistically significant. This next question is one that raises more questions than answers, and it's the same issue with substance use and other compulsive behaviors. Because what we know about compulsions and behavioral addictions and gambling is that it's actually less about the frequency and more about the potency and the relative harms and costs. You already know this, right? It's less about whether you consumed a single edible THC gummy on any particular occasion. It's about the potency of the THC itself. And so here's how our sample responded. A relatively small proportion of students reported betting a few times a week or daily. I'm tempted to call this good news, but we know from the prevention paradox I shared with you earlier that frequency is not necessarily a proxy for problem gambling. And that brings us to the next question about wager amounts. And here, the data looks very similar to a national poll commissioned by the NCAA in 2023 of young adults age 18 to 22. And for the most part, bettors in our sample are making relatively small wagers. What's your hypothesis here? If you had to guess, would you say more of our students are engaged in land-based betting or online gambling? I bet everybody would get this one right. Even though online sports betting is relatively new in the US, the science predicts this one 100%. When you look at the literature about substance use disorders, the number one predictor of the particular substance of abuse, whether it's alcohol, tobacco, opioids, cannabis, et cetera, for any particular individual is accessibility. How quickly can you get your hands on it? How cheap is it? And since we're in a no-holds-barred kind of situation with sports betting, open 24/7, low regulation, you don't need to drive there, you don't need to prove how old you are sometimes. Any gambling you do over the device in your pocket on an app is basically like mainlining a drug. And it can almost give you an instantaneous hit or high, even though it may be smaller than what you might get with something like cocaine. These next questions assess riskier behaviors associated with gambling. The first one is a custom question, and this one was of particular interest because there's nothing like it in the literature and the population, and because of anecdotal reports from faculty and staff about people being distracted on their phones and computers in class. And here's what we found. I think these numbers in the double digits suggest that a lot of bandwidth of college students in our sample are taken up not by some of the usual developmental milestones that many of us might have encountered when we were in college. Here are some more risk questions, and what do you think? So 8%, 12, and 4. In hindsight, being 2020, I wish we had asked this last question a little differently, because I wonder if the 4% would be higher if we had removed the word serious and repeated. This is a textbook example of why questions pitched to the more severe end of the spectrum will fail to detect potential problems. I know from the many phone calls and conversations I've had that many people are frustrated by kids at the dinner table on their phones, watching the outcome of bets, dates, and spouses who are distracted and they don't know why. These first two data points look relatively consistent with the historical literature about the prevalence of gambling disorder and problem gambling, but the last point is not. 17.3% of the bettors in our sample reported making attempts to withdraw from sports betting, meaning they think they have a problem, it might be causing some kind of issue in their life, and they're trying to cut back. This last question held some surprises. First, this is an open-ended voluntary question, and the response rate was relatively high. For students to make it all the way to the end of the survey and then opt in to greater participation was really interesting to see. I conducted a thematic analysis of the qualitative feedback, and it revealed these major themes. In that first box, the largest one, the one that belongs to industry, the number one comment about sports betting, the sports betting industry, was related to advertising, incentives, and promotions. Students used words like annoying and predatory. Their words, not mine. And the comments made me wonder, do the advertising and incentives really work? I'm not so sure. The customer churn rates in the industry are very high. What does longer-term customer retention even look like in this relatively new industry? And why do wealthy, savvy professional athletes and actors endorse sports betting? What's in it for them besides the money? So earlier, I talked about the edges of 5 powerful industries coming together to create a product and experience unlike anything we've experienced before: sports, gambling, tech, finance, and analytics. This is an example of a classic ecological phenomenon called the edge effect. And it's simple. What's observed in nature is that the area where 2 ecosystems meet is where the most diverse and creative habitats and species emerge. And what you see here is an estuary in the middle zone, a large freshwater stream meeting the saltwater tide of the ocean. And this is an example of an ecological edge, a place that creates the conditions for life and diversity that is richer than the surrounding areas. For the MBA students in the crowd, you understand this intuitively from the group projects that you're assigned. At their best and most high functioning, and when everyone's engaged, the sum is almost always greater than the parts, and the solutions emerge that were previously unimaginable. So I'd like to end today with an invitation, and there are 3 parts, and I hope you'll take me up on all 3. The first is to imagine a new edge in this online sports betting ecosystem. What might be the competitive advantage of bringing health and well-being and mental health into the picture? And I don't just mean referring people to gambling counseling or allowing people to self-ban themselves. I don't know if there's a win-win here, but I bet some of you have great ideas. The second is to complete the data set. The dark ages we're in are not because of data quantity or even quality. It's due to poor data exchange and interoperability. There is great data that is hermetically sealed in closed systems. And as you know, data is not the same thing as knowledge. Help solve the multivariate equation about the risks and harms of sports gambling to college students. What are the independent variables we're not considering? Some of the companies here today have already identified some of these variables. Frequency of deposits, timing of bets, i.e. not on a Saturday, failed deposits, bets placed between midnight and 4 a.m., in-app loan applications, credit cards used for cash purchases. Once we understand all of the variables, we can bring AI and predictive analytics to bear on the issue of harm and human cost. And that brings me to the final invitation: to reimagine value. The C variable in particular in this simple equation of value equals quality over cost. Imagine not just the financial cost, but the human costs as well. However you define the value of sports betting in your own mind, it's clear that the C variable in this equation is currently underpowered. If you'd like to read more about the working paper, it's linked here. I hope you'll connect and open to questions.
That was really amazing. Thank you. One thing I'm curious about, were there any questions about whether the students understood that they were going to lose money in the long run, or if they had this idea that I'm actually doing this and, can make money on a Tuesday night? So, yeah.
You're talking about odds of winning? Yeah, great question, and something I've been myself learning a lot about from the Michael Lewis podcast, and I think there's a lot of reasons why young developing brains probably overestimate their value, the odds of winning. And so, no, we didn't ask about that, but it's a great question because I think it would be interesting to actually compare actual with predicted odds. Now, it's obviously a little challenging because really good bettors get kicked out of the online platforms. So it's, again, one of these impossible calculations to solve. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. So the juxtaposition between this talk and the previous one I was at was pretty fascinating. We had FanDuel CEO Amy Lowe say that sports betting is currently a $20 billion industry, and she projects it to get to over 70. We see like this battle that plays out in many industries between public health and what's good for society and the profit incentive. And so this is another example of that. My question to you is, how do you sort of fight that fight? Is it policy? Is it societal shifts? Is it something else? What do you think?
Yeah, brilliant question. I think your observations are spot on. I think the gambling sector is projected to even get bigger, according to the American Gaming Association, especially online sports betting and iGaming. Personally, I try to sort of approach it from both at a microscopic individual level, right? Those phone calls, taking care of people in the clinic, working with families. But the scale of that impact is not as great as if you can actually work on systems and policies. That's where you get the biggest scale and spread of impact, which is why I think it takes industry looking at the platforms themselves and sharing the data for us to even know what would need to change to actually move the needle in a really big way. Because the forces of these 5 industries is very huge, right? So systems and policies, it's basically an unregulated industry right now. So I'm not pro or against any, I'm not talking about, federal or state should intervene or shouldn't, but I don't think it's coming anytime soon, would be my prediction, not a betting person. And so I'm looking at the private sector. You guys have got the great data, right? Like, let's use it for good. And people have talked about that at this conference before. Great question.
Awesome. Thank you, Lindsay. One more round of applause for Lindsay Mortensen. Thank you.